quality education despite increased cost. There was quite clearly a majority and a substantial majority of the panelists and those in the audience who favored that. It was my job, I felt, to make sure that the alternative positions were heard, that the senators who had other plans and the legislators who thought otherwise had an opportunity to speak, and we made sure that they did, and that the President of the Conservative Union, who's totally against any taxation, had a chance to speak. Even the issue of vouchers, which is not a burning issue in Tennessee right now, was raised late in the program by me, primarily because I thought it's been part of the dialogue and needed to be brought out.
Why don't you say something about vouchers? Exactly.
Well, here's the and I should say before I go on too far, I don't want to fly under false colors. I am an editorialist. I have expressed opinions in the newspaper about these matters. For a long, long time, I've felt that tax equity required an income tax in Tennessee, and I don't apologize for that. I understand it's a minority position, that most people don't agree with it, but I believe that if we look at it long enough and carefully enough, that more and more people will understand that we just can't go on raising the sales tax forever. And also, I've taken a position against vouchers. I wanted it raised because people on the other side deserve to be heard on this subject, but the voucher one program would provide that a parent, rather than having to send a child to the public school, would be given an amount of money by the federal government, or maybe by the state government, and that parent could then choose to send the child to a private school. Now, in my judgment, that program would wreck the public school system, and I think that the public school system, although I am not a product of it, I think the public school system has been the mainstay of the strength of this country, and I think it would be a tragic mistake to go forward with that program. Now, those who are on the other side say that a voucher system would create competition and would force public schools to improve. The people I know in public education are striving mightily with limited resources to improve the quality in the schools. And I don't think you need to take money away and give it to private schools in order to make public schools better. I think the answer is to put more resources into public schools and let the great teachers who are there do more with more. So that's the issue of vouchers, and it came up. Another ancillary issue that came up was, why can't we have a lottery in Tennessee? And that issue was raised by a couple of people who telephoned in. And incidentally, I would say there were thousands of calls, well over 3,000 calls by the time we went off the air. And we took a poll, and the people who responded to that poll overwhelmingly stated that they don't think the quality of education is good enough in Tennessee and that it must be better. The poll didn't ask the second question, are you willing to pay to make it better, so we don't know. But I think that it was clear from the people who called in that if you could get a lottery and commit that lottery money to education, it would be worthwhile. We have in Tennessee a constitutional barrier against the lottery. So if you can't change the Constitution, or if you can't get the Supreme Court to say that interpretation of the language of the Constitution is flawed, then we can't have a lottery. And it would take a great deal of time to get the Constitution changed. The governor said, if the people want to change the Constitution, that's fine. In the meantime, what are we going to do about the children? But that issue of lottery was also raised. Very good, and I think that you mentioned one of the areas that really created the crisis in public education in the state of Tennessee, and that had to do with a ruling by the court. And this is the whole controversy over rural versus urban schools. Yes. And why don't you give us some information in reference to what that controversy is all about and how people felt about that? Lawyers went to Chancery Court here in Nashville, to Chancellor High, and lawyers for the rural schools. And they said if you analyze what's happening in rural schools as opposed to what's happening in urban schools, schools like the big cities in Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga, you will find that children in the poorer rural counties are getting shortchanged. you look at the numbers of dollars spent on education, and you find out that that is very, very true. And Chancellor High came down on the side of the rural schools and ruled that there had to be equity in education. Now, it's a more complex ruling than that because when you get into what the Chancellor says, you have to address the question of how you deal with it. You can read what he said and conclude that he is almost mandating that the state take over all funding of public education. Now, I raised the question with Lewis Donaldson during the program. He was the lawyer for the rural schools. If that was a possibility, he said that you could read that that's not an accurate reading, but the question of what the Chancellor is really asking for is not that clear. He was not that definitive. He simply is saying that if there is going to be a program which tax dollars are spent on children, there has to be equity. Now, another aspect of the problem is that in urban centers, there are inner city problems that where some of the schools are older, deteriorating, where some of them are located in inferior neighborhoods. Court-ordered busing means that people must travel long miles to those inner city schools, and the urban school districts complain that it's unfair simply to look at the city schools and the urban schools and say they are poorer because they're getting less. The people in the city schools say, look at these problems that must be addressed in the inner cities. I mean, we are required to put more money into the inner city schools, and that's a problem the urban schools don't have, and we think we deserve some consideration for that. I personally believe that if some of those cities had put more money into the inner city schools, the result would have been that they could have validated that with the Chancellor much more effectively. But the Chancellor lives here in Nashville, and he sees some of the inner city schools, and you know, you look at some of them and you know they are inferior in terms of structure and facilities, and so that argument failed. It's going to have to be addressed, though, ultimately, because if you're going to have equity between urban schools and rural schools, you're going to have equity between rural schools, urban schools in higher-end districts, and urban schools in the inner city. So I think it's a stool that stands on three legs, not two, but that has not yet been addressed, but it'll have to be.
Very good. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things that also came up had to do with what we might call the nuts and bolts of education, and I think you've alluded to it when you talked about transportation. But let's look at the area of transportation, the area of classrooms, and the area of sports. I think that these are three areas that more than anything impact upon the operation of a school as constructed, I mean, whether we get the money or not. Now, what about transportation? And I think you alluded to that just a while ago, but let's talk about that.
Well, yeah, you know, there are two problems here. One has to do with transportation generally, and the other has to do with transportation that's the result of a court order to desegregate. Since 1954, we've been moving more and more in the direction towards supporting transportation. That's the Brown versus Board of Education decision. What flowed from that several years later was an order that school districts bus students in order to provide a racial balance. That after the court had found that separate but equal simply could not stand because it was a contradiction in a term, we have had that sort of transportation, and it has been expensive. Because nobody was complaining about the expense of transportation as long as it was one way, as long as you were busing black kids past white schools to go to black schools, nobody was really complaining about it. But, you know, it has become controversial. There are two issues here then. One, everybody thinks of busing as being expensive, but if you cut out court-ordered busing, you're still going to have to get people to school, and that's still very, very costly. And as I mentioned, there is one school district that's